There is a text written before the flood that describes something that should have been impossible after the flood. It describes it with a precision that does not seem mythical, but forensic: attributes, powers, origin, nature. And the most disturbing thing is not what it describes, but that every subsequent civilization found it exactly where the text said. Greece found it, Mesopotamia found it. The Hebrew tradition had known it forever and preferred not to name it. Medieval Europe persecuted it for centuries without knowing its true name, without understanding where it really came from. The text that described it was burned by order of the church councils in the 2nd century after Christ. But what it described was not burned, because what it described was already in the world. It had already taken deep roots. Today that text is opened. Today the witnesses are called, and in the end the names will be pronounced for the first time. But for the names to have weight, first the case must be built from the beginning, from before the water. One must understand what the watchers were, what they did, and what they left in the world that no flood could erase. Because what they left was not just a race of giants, it was something more subtle, more persistent, more difficult to exterminate. To understand what survived, one must first understand what was destroyed and why it was destroyed with such urgency. The Book of Enoch Minor. It was sacred scripture for Jesus, for the apostles, for the first communities. It is cited directly by Peter, Judas, and Paul. Its images permeate the apocalypse from beginning to end, without anyone explaining it. It was removed from the canon at the Council of Laodicea in the year 363 and confirmed apocryphal in Carthage in 397. The official reason was dubious authorship. The real reason was that it told too much about the true origin of evil in the world. They did not destroy it completely because the Ethiopian church never considered it apocryphal and copied it for 1,600 years. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave next to the Dead Sea and heard ancient pottery break. Inside they found fragments of the Book of the Giants, dated by carbon-14 before Christ in the library of the Essenes. It was not late Christian heresy. It was pre-Christian scripture that the Qumran community studied along with Isaiah and Deuteronomy. What that text describes about the women who joined the Watchers is what the councils did not want you to know. And it is also the key that explains something that no comparative mythology manual has managed to explain satisfactorily: why the same supernatural female figure appears in all cultures of the world with the same exact attributes. To answer that question, one must return to the world that existed before the water, the world that the flood tried to erase. Imagine an antediluvian earth where the boundaries between the spiritual and material planes were permeable, almost non-existent. From the heights, 200 beings that the Book of Enoch calls the Watchers contemplated the nascent civilization of Adam. The answer to that question has been buried for 2,000 years under declarations of apocryphality and library bonfires. But the texts survived. The Dead Sea Scrolls are physical, datable, unquestionable as material evidence, and what they say about the mothers of the Nephilim is what no council could burn completely because it was too widespread. They were guardians of the cosmic order, custodians of knowledge that the universe had reserved for planes higher than the human, but they saw the daughters of men and felt something that no being of their nature should have felt: desire to descend. Chapter 6 of Enoch narrates it with a coldness that chills. They swore a pact on Mount Hermon and descended together. They took wives from among the daughters of men. The Hebrew text uses a word that implies a deliberate and calculated act. It was not thoughtless passion. It was a metaphysical conspiracy to insert their lineage into the human genetic chain. In exchange for access to the mortal plane, they taught them what no human should know yet: metallurgy, astrology, enchantments. They taught them to read the movements of the stars, to prepare poisons and medicines of supernatural power, to invoke entities. The daughters of men were not passive victims. They were initiated into a knowledge that transformed them irreversibly. From that union were born the Nephilim, the giants, creatures that were neither angels nor humans, but something for which no category exists. They devoured the resources of humanity, practiced cannibalism, sowed terror in a land that cried out to be liberated. God heard that cry. The archangels received the order. The flood was the answer to the greatest transgression of cosmic history. But before talking about the flood, one must stop at the mothers, at what happened to them, at what they carried inside. Because the flood destroyed the bodies of the Nephilim. Their spirits, however, did not ascend or descend correctly. They remained suspended, according to Enoch, as hungry interplanar entities, condemned to wander seeking incarnation forever. And the mothers, the initiated women, the wives of the Watchers, the sacred text keeps an eloquent silence about them. A silence that the Book of Jubilees breaks into fragments, that the Zohar whispers in parables. That history screams in images, because something of what they carried did not die with the water. Something passed to the other side of the flood and found a way to continue. Let us call the first witness. The first witness is Greek civilization, the most documented of Western antiquity. The Greeks were rationalists to the letter. Geometry, philosophy, astronomy, medicine were not given to irrational terror. However, at the heart of their mythology exists a figure before whom even their most powerful gods retreated with caution. A female figure of mysterious origin, connected to the primordial powers before Olympus, before Zeus himself. The Greeks described her with attributes that, seen from the Book of Enoch, are specific and coherent. She had a power over matter that defied all natural logic. She could alter the physical state of living beings just by looking at them. The Book of Jubilees goes further than Enoch, detailing that theologians have systematically ignored for centuries. It says that the Watchers did not appear physically immediately. First, they seduced the women in dreams and visions. For weeks, perhaps months, they altered their perception of reality before there was any physical contact. The initiated women not only received knowledge, they were reprogrammed at a level that no purification ritual reached. Her head was crowned by snakes, the universal symbol of forbidden knowledge in all ancient Semitic traditions. When she died, from her body did not spring human blood, but creatures. One of them was a giant of supernatural power. The Greeks themselves admitted that it had not always been like that there was a transformation, a crossing of a line that should not be crossed. She was transformed after having touched something sacred in a forbidden way, after having accessed a power that did not belong to her. Does it sound familiar? Should it? Because the Book of Enoch describes exactly that process for the initiated daughters of men. The Greeks did not invent this figure. They inherited it from a tradition older than Greece, older than Egypt, older than Sumer. They inherited it from the collective memory, from a world that existed before the flood and transmitted its terrors in the form of myth. But the first witness has not finished, because the Greeks also knew other figures of the same type, of the same dark origin. Female creatures with supernatural voice that attracted men toward destruction with a beauty that reason could not resist. Ulysses had to tie himself to the mast of his ship to not throw himself into the sea upon hearing them. His companions plugged their ears with wax. What kind of power is that? It is not ordinary seduction. It is the power of something that operates at a level that precedes will. The Book of Jubilees describes exactly that mechanism. The Watchers seduced the women first in dreams and visions, before taking physical form, before carnal contact. They had already altered the perception and the will of their chosen ones. The initiated daughters carried in their voice, in their presence, in their gaze, something that was no longer completely human. The first witness rests. What it described exists in the oldest Greek texts, but the second witness goes back even further. The second witness comes from 3,000 years before Greece. The second witness speaks in cuneiform from clay tablets. Sumerian and Babylonian civilization left records of a supernatural female figure that makes the Greek testimony pale, not for its drama, but for its antiquity. These tablets are contemporary with the earliest biblical texts, if not earlier. The figure they describe is a nocturnal, female entity, with power over life and death, especially over newborns. The cuneiform texts explicitly associate her with the Anunnaki, the beings that descended from the sky. Those who came from above. In Akkadian, her name contains the root that means wind and night and something else. The root that denotes origin in another plane of existence. Babylonian priests developed specific rituals to protect themselves from her, amulets, invocations, protection formulas. Why did a civilization as sophisticated as Babylon dedicate so much effort to protecting itself from something that should be mere superstition? Because the priests of Babylon knew texts that described her real origin, texts that circulated in parallel to the accounts of Enoch. The scholar Hermann Gunkel documented in 1895 the exact correspondences between Mesopotamian texts and Hebrew Genesis. But there is a detail of the Greek testimony that modern academics have ignored in a systematic and revealing way. The oldest texts before Hesiod describe these figures not as monsters, but as transitional beings, beings that had been something before what they were, that kept memory of an earlier state closer to the human. That memory of a transformation, of a before and an after, is exactly what the Book of Enoch describes for the mothers. They are not cultural coincidences. They are parallel memories of the same event seen from the two shores of the antediluvian world. The Babylonian figure shares with the Greek figure attributes impossible to explain by simple cultural contact between civilizations. Both are female. Both have powers that transcend physics. Both are connected to beings that descended from the sky. Both generate in whoever finds them a mixture of irresistible attraction and absolute terror that nothing purely human produces. The second witness has spoken, and what it said coincides with the first in every detail that matters. Let us call the third. The third witness is the most uncomfortable of all because it belongs to the same tradition that produced the Book of Enoch. The Hebrew tradition has known this figure since before the flood. The rabbis commented on it with visible discomfort for centuries. They could not deny it because it was in texts too old and too venerated to be simply discarded. They could not explain it within the official theological framework, because its origin pointed towards something that the canon had silenced. The Talmud mentions it. The Zohar dedicates entire pages to it. The Kabbalistic tradition turned it into one of its central themes. According to these sources, she existed before Eve, according to these sources. She refused to submit to the order and fled to the primordial chaos. She joined the fallen beings and begat creatures that should not exist. She became the mother of a lineage that the world does not recognize. The Zohar connects her explicitly with the Nephilim through the concept of mixed souls, entities neither human nor angelic. And here's the detail that the rabbis could never solve: her deep relationship with the lineage of the mothers of the flood. Because the figure that the Hebrew tradition describes shares with the Greek and Babylonian figures the same fundamental attributes: nocturnal power, connection with the fallen, border nature between worlds, capacity to beget what has no category. The most honest rabbis admitted it. There is something in this figure that Genesis does not explain and that Enoch did explain with precision. Enoch was removed from the canon precisely because it explained too well where this figure came from and what its existence meant. The third witness has testified, and its declaration is the most revealing because it comes from within the same tradition that used it. But the Babylonian testimony contains an additional element that the Greek does not have, and that turns out to be extraordinarily specific. The priests of Babylon described the method by which this figure transmitted its nature to the following generations. It was not ordinary biological inheritance. It was something that was activated under certain conditions. That could be asleep for generations. The Book of Jubilees describes exactly that mechanism of latent transmission. The Babylonians had documented it first. There remains a fourth witness, the most recent, the one that did not leave texts but ashes, the one that speaks from the silence of medieval bonfires. The fourth witness does not speak in Greek, nor in cuneiform, nor in Hebrew. The fourth witness speaks in the language of fire. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, Europe executed between 40,000 and 60,000 people accused of witchcraft. The majority were women, and what they were accused of possessing was not a learned ability, but something they carried inside. The Malleus Maleficarum, the witch-hunting manual published in 1487, describes with disturbing detail what the inquisitors were looking for. They were looking for women with supernatural knowledge of plants and stars, women who spoke with entities invisible to others, women who possessed a power over life and death that no human education could explain nor confer to anyone. The inquisitors did not know exactly what they were looking for, but they recognized it when they found it. They called it a pact with the devil, without the Book of Enoch, without the antediluvian context, without the story of the mothers of the Nephilim. That was all they could say. But the Book of Enoch, which the Ethiopian monks copied by candlelight while Europe burned its custodians, clarifies it. The daughters initiated by the Watchers received a knowledge that is transmitted, that persists, that does not die with the water. The Book of Jubilees is explicit. That knowledge was preserved and passed to the other side of the flood through the sons of Noah. The oldest rabbinical traditions whisper that something of the contaminated lineage got on the ark without Noah knowing it completely. This explains the immediate reappearance of the giants in Canaan, after the flood. Entire tribes of beings of supernatural stature. This explains the Mosaic laws against witchcraft, so absolute, so devoid of nuances, as if they were fighting something specific. This explains the order to exterminate certain tribes in Canaan. It was not ethnic cleansing. It was containment of a lineage with a concrete history. And this explains why in medieval Europe, 1,000 years later, the inquisitors kept finding women with that ancient knowledge. They had not learned it. They carried it. It was a thread from generation to generation, from before the flood until the medieval bonfires. The fourth witness has testified from the silence. The four testimonies are on the table. It is time for the closing argument, and there is one last element of the Hebrew testimony that connects everything in a way that no other explanation can match. The Zohar, in its section on the origins of evil, describes explicitly how the knowledge of the Watchers was transmitted. It speaks of women who carried in their nature something that the angels had deposited in the human lineage in a permanent way. It speaks of that something as a flame that water does not extinguish, that time does not extinguish, that reappears when conditions allow it. 4 witnesses, 4 civilizations, 4 millennia of separate history, and the same figure at the center of everything, female, of origin in a transgression of boundaries between worlds, bearer of a knowledge that should not be human, with power over matter, over life, over the will of those who find her, connected to beings that descended from the sky. Greece saw her and built temples to protect itself. Babylon developed protection rituals that lasted 1,000 years uninterrupted. The Hebrew tradition included her in its most secret texts and discussed her in its academies with a discomfort that never disappeared. Medieval Europe persecuted her for 3 centuries and executed tens of thousands of women trying to extirpate her from the known world. Why so much urgency? Why so much fear? Why that systematic and global effort to suppress something that should be only myth? Because it was not myth. The Book of Enoch that the councils burned and the Ethiopian monks preserved makes it absolutely clear. The mothers of the Nephilim were transformed. The knowledge they received did not disappear with their bodies in the flood. It survived in their descendants, diluted but potent. transmitted from mother to daughter through generations that history did not record. And those descendants were found by every civilization that had eyes open enough to recognize them when they appeared. Each civilization called them by a different name, because none had the original text that named them correctly. None, except the tradition that preserved the Book of Enoch. None, except those who also read the Book of the Giants. It is time to pronounce those names. It is time to connect the four testimonies with the text that explains them all. Because the names that Greece used, that Babylon used, that the Hebrew tradition knew, that Europe feared, all point to the same origin. The figure that the Greeks described with snakes on her head that turned to stone whoever looked at her directly. The priestess transformed after crossing the border between the sacred and the forbidden, between the human and the divine, creature before whom the Greek gods themselves retreated because they knew where she came from and what she carried in her nature. That figure has a name that Greek mythology gave her without understanding that it was the name of an inheritance. Not an invention. She is called Medusa. The Book of Enoch describes exactly that process. Initiated woman, transformed. No longer completely human, the creatures that the Greeks knew with irresistible voice, that dragged men toward death from the water, those that operated on the will before reason could intervene, exactly as the Watchers operated on the mothers, but the fourth witness has an element that the other three do not have. It has dates, it has names, it has judicial records. The archives of the Spanish and Italian Inquisition document with bureaucratic precision what was found in each case. Knowledge of herbs that contemporary doctors could not identify, rituals without traceable origin in any living tradition. As if that knowledge had not been learned in this life, but remembered from somewhere deeper and older. Those figures have names that mythology called in different ways, but that the text of Enoch groups in a single category. They are called sirens. Their power over the will is the exact echo of the power with which the Watchers seduced the mothers. The figure that the Hebrew tradition knew since before the flood that the rabbis commented on with discomfort for centuries. The one that the Zohar connects to the Nephilim. The one that begat creatures with the fallen. The one that the official canon could never explain. That figure has a Hebrew name that appears in texts as old as Genesis itself, although Genesis preferred not to include her. She is called Lilith. The Zohar says it without ambiguity. Her nature is that of mixed souls, the lineage that crossed the forbidden border, and the women that medieval Europe persecuted for centuries, that the inquisitors did not know how to name, but recognized upon finding them, the bearers of knowledge of stars and plants impossible to confer by human education that spoke with invisible entities, the heirs of the curriculum that the Watchers taught on Mount Hermon in exchange for access to the human lineage. They were called witches, and what the inquisitors were chasing was the last echo of the knowledge that the Watchers sowed. Medusa, sirens, Lilith, witches, four names that four civilizations gave to the same inheritance without having the original text. The text was there from the beginning. It was burned precisely because it explained everything with too much precision and clarity. The Book of Enoch described before Greece existed, before the peak of Babylon, before the medieval bonfires. It described them as inevitable inheritance of the transgression of the Watchers, the female inheritance that the water could not wash away. And now that you have the text and the names, the world you thought you knew has a crack through which a different light enters, because if this lineage is real, if these figures are documented inheritance and not invention, the battle they describe did not end. The same Watchers that descended to Mount Hermon operate today with different tools, but with the same manual as always. The promise of knowledge that transcends human limits of power beyond what is permitted. The text has not changed. Only the names on the cover have changed, and whoever knows the original recognizes the trap, even if it comes wrapped in technology. If this truth ignited something you had not extinguished. Subscribe to continue unearthing what they prefer you do not find. 4 witnesses. 4 independent descriptions and a single text that anticipates them all with precision that does not admit chance. The Book of Enoch described the origin. The Book of Jubilees described the mechanism of transmission. The Zohar described the persistence and the archives of 4 civilizations documented without knowing it. The result of that origin, that mechanism, that persistence, now only the names are left to be pronounced. The names that the original text always knew, and that the world could never completely forget.